Hello, my name is Justin Perkins. Welcome to another episode of WaveLab Workflows. Today we're going to be going over all the different ways that you can render audio from WaveLab, because I feel like whenever I do a video, I explain something, and then by the time I get to rendering, the video is already pretty long, and we kind of gloss over some rendering details. So I thought it would be good to just do a focused rendering video. So that's what we're going to do today. There's many ways to render from the audio montage, the audio editor. You can even do some bouncing and super clip stuff within the audio montage, which I'll show you. So we'll talk about all sorts of ways to render audio. Well, we get rolling here. Thanks for tuning in again. If there's any issues with the stream, feel free to put it in the chat. If you have any questions, also feel free to put it in the chat, because I try to look at those as I do these. And before we get rolling, I just wanted to mention that next month, we're going to have a special guest mastering engineer named Katie Tavini from the UK. I thought it'd be fun to end the year with something a little lighter, a little more fun. We'll do an interview, but we're also going to do just a general mastering Q&A. So we're going to get away from WaveLab specifically and just open it up to any and all mastering questions for Katie or myself or both of us. So watch for that one. It's on December. Let me just double check my notes. I believe it's December 15th. Should have had that. It's actually December 14th, 2022. Same time, but on December 14th, we'll be doing that with Katie Tavini. So watch for that. Mark your calendars. Of course, there'll be the usual announcements, but just wanted to mention that that's going to be a general mastering Q&A just to kind of wrap up the year. So let's get into this rendering episode. Like I mentioned, it seems like rendering kind of gets glossed over on some of these videos I do because of, they already go a little bit long, and then I just say render this, render that. There's a lot of powerful rendering tools in WaveLab, which is a big part of why I use it for mastering. The other day I received a Pro Tools session from a client because they did a rough sequence of their album in Pro Tools and put in some generic markers, and it was honestly kind of a headache to get his individual files out of Pro Tools and get them into a mastering context. So it made me really appreciate all the great stuff about WaveLab rendering. I'm going to start with the audio editor, because even though I don't use the audio editor, I know some people do, and there's honestly less things to show you about rendering from the audio editor, so we'll just get that out of the way, and then we'll kind of get into rendering from the montage, because there's a lot of variations when you render from the montage. So for those that aren't familiar, you may want to go back and watch the video that talks about the difference between the audio montage and audio editor. But they're basically just two different environments in WaveLab. As you can see in my current screen, it says audio montage, and then I'm going to show you the audio editor. So let's do that. Let's get one of these files in the audio editor. I have a couple mock-up sessions here. So this is the audio editor. Now you can see it says audio editor in the top left. So again, this is destructive. So I'm directly editing this file, whereas in the montage, there's an actual .mon file that stores all the data. Let's go back to the editor. So if you're in the audio editor, there's a couple things in the process tab that you can do, such as reversing stuff. This is just a pink noise sample, so it's not very exciting, but you can reverse audio. You can change the gain. You can do a lot of things directly, and then of course you have to save the file, but I want to get into more rendering, if you had plugins and things like that. So the only place to insert plugins with the audio editor is the master section, which, as most of you know by now, I keep that hidden and floating. If you had the default WaveLab layout, you might look more like this, so you can see the master section more easily. So we have this effects tab, and I did a whole episode about the master section as well, so you may want to go back and watch that. I'll keep it in the default layout for this particular part of the video to make things easier to see. So if I wanted to apply some effects to this piece of audio, whether it's EQ, compression, or a number of things. You can have a lot of effects. The only way to do that is in the master section in the effects tab. I think this goes up to 15 slots now if you need more. So let me just load in something simple that's easy to see. A gain plugin, and I'll reduce it by 6 decibels. For some reason it didn't save that preset. So let's save the preset. Anyway, so now I have a plugin that's running live and it's reducing it by 6 decibels. Because if I bypass it, just to give you a reference point, if I bypass this plugin, you can see that the pink noise peaks at about -20. If I enable the plugin, it's peaking at -26. So I'm reducing it by 6 decibels. Not very exciting, but I try to keep it basic for these types of videos. So let's show you some options here for locking in this processing. The first and most direct way is this somewhat hidden render in place button in the plugin window. Render in place. So if I don't select anything, it's going to render the whole file. So you can see it dropped it down 6 decibels. If I select an area, it's just going to render that area. So that's a really direct way of rendering audio. It does raise some questions because it's a 24-bit, well, if it were a 24-bit file, it's going to increase the bit depth, so you, in theory, would want a dither, but I don't want to open that can of worms. But I just wanted to point out the render in place button, because I think a lot of people don't know it's there, because it's pretty tiny. But I don't really use it very often, because I don't want to commit to things like that. But let's say I dialed in a plugin chain that I really liked. We can add a master rig with something. Let's say I love how this sounds, and I want to commit to that in the audio editor. There is a render button down here at the bottom right, and it opens up this, in my opinion, a little busier than needs to be screen. I really like to render from the render ribbon tab, which basically gives you the same options. So this applies to the audio montage and the editor, but there's always a render source. If you go from left to right, render source. There's not a lot of options in the audio editor because, we don't have things like CD tracks and track groups and all this stuff, but you can see that there's a few things. If you want to render the whole file, you can have markers in here, and you could render a specific mark region, which we'll get into that more in the audio montage. But for now, we want to render the whole file because we like how this sounds, and we want to basically we want to create a new file. Is how it's going to work. It's what I suggest, because you always want to be able to get back to this. You don't want to, in most cases, you don't want to destructively change this file permanently. You want to render a new one so that you would use your rendered work, but you still have the original file to fall back on. There's a whole bunch of render presets and naming scheme, which we're going to get into in the montage section, but we're going to render this whole file. We got to give it a name. We'll just call it, test version 1. We can pick the format, and I'm going to dig into formats later too, but we'll call it a 24-bit wave. That's what we want to render. Now, while I'm on this topic, if you check out the bit depth meter, you can see we have floating point audio. So if we were going to render a 24-bit file, WaveLab does not automatically dither. Some people think that DAWs will automatically dither if you set it to 16 or 24-bit. That's not the case with WaveLab at all, and most DAWs. So what we need to do is either save it at the native bit depth of the processing, or we can insert a dithering plugin. And I can insert a dither plugin in the effects section or in the actual dithering area. It doesn't really matter, to be honest with you, as long as it's last, as long as it's after any processing that's occurring. including sample rate, including fades, things like that. You want your dithering to be last. So let's insert Steinberg Lin dither. And we could change it to 24-bit. There's a lot of different features that I don't want to get into, but now we have, if I press play and look at the bit depth meter, now we have 24-bit audio. If I bypass it, you can see that we have floating point audio. So just be aware of what you're doing when you're dithering. I think the bit depth meter really helps when you're dithering and rendering. So now I'm ready to render actual 24-bit audio. So I've given it a name. There's all these naming schemes that I'll get into in the other thing when I do the montage. I pick the format. You can render multiple formats. I'm choosing single format, so that means I can choose that it's a wave. I can choose that you can choose mono, stereo. You can have it match the input stream, which is what I usually do, match the sample rate. All these types of things. But let's just render a 24-bit file and see what happens. So I'll just choose the desktop out of ease. I'm going to go through these options more when I get to the montage, but just be aware that they're here. The main option I want to talk about right now is this option of bypassing the master section on resulting audio file. That's an important one because, as you know, the master section is not tied to any particular file. You can save it and reload it, but all these plugins that I have inserted, if I go to this other montage, which is not related in any way, it's passing through the same plugin. So the thing to remember with the master section is it's active on basically whatever you're playing. And what that setting does is when I render this file, you want to pay attention down here to this little star with a cross over it, because when I render the file, watch what happens to the resulting file. Obviously the resulting file is smaller because I was turning the gain down, so we can see that the processing happened, but see how this red icon is flashing. That means the master section is bypassed because we don't want to hear the processing again when we check this file. We want to hear the result. We want to hear just the rendering result. We don't want to hear additional double the processing. That would be bad. Now if I go back to the source file, you can see that that option undid itself and we're hearing it through the plugins. But when I flip to the rendered file, you can see that even though that meter is moving, the master section is bypassed and we're not hearing the plugins twice. So that's really the main setting to be aware of when you're rendering from the audio editor, is just the bypass master section resulting file. You can choose to have the file open or not, depending on what you're doing. You may or may not want your rendered file to open. I like it typically to open so I can check it, make sure the rendering was correct. But depending on what you're doing, you may find it annoying that the file opens and you can open them manually later. It's really your choice. The other options are pretty self-explanatory. I'll just get into them now, I guess. You can bypass the master section on rendering, which I actually do in the audio montage because I don't use the master section. I bypass it just out of precaution, just to be extra safe. Autosave master section preset, I'll leave it highlighted here. But this does save the master section settings when you render a file. For me, I don't like to rely on the automatic stuff because it has the potential to something to go wrong. I like to manually load and save the master section settings with the file just to be safe. Fade in and out, probably not. This is going to be really user dependent, but you can add little fades at the heads and tails of the file, and those settings are determined in the in this section here in the preferences. As far as, I think it's in here, global audio, fades. So I've never had a case where I always want fade-ins automatically. I like to control that myself in the montage, but it is there. Reverb tail, it's not necessarily specific to reverb plugins, but obviously if we were trying to add a reverb to this file, we would want it to be longer than the original file, because even when that file stops, the reverb is going to carry on for as long as the reverb is. So you can choose that option if you need to add the reverb tail or just any latency that the plugin is reporting. Copy markers, self-explanatory. If I had markers in here and rendered a new file, the markers would stay embedded with the file. You can have exclusion ranges. So a lot of these are self-explanatory. But that's basically the audio editor. I'm going to spend more time in the montage, but as I mentioned, you really are limited to just the master section when it comes to the audio editor as far as where to place plugins, and you just have to be really careful about saving and loading the master section settings so they stay with your file. There's a whole video about that as well. Again, resampling, we'll save that. I'm going to do a whole episode on sample rate conversion, but if I were changing the sample rate, I would want to put my dither plugin in the actual dithering section, so it's occurring after all my other processing. And then while we're at it, there is a playback processing section, and any plugins in here are just heard or measured and not part of the rendering process. So some people have room correction software or speaker correction software that they use. You would definitely want to put it in the playback processing slot so that you're hearing it, but it's not being rendered by mistake, and so that it's not influencing the meters in WaveLab. So let's say you had a room correction plugin inserted in the playback processing and it's changing the EQ and level and all sorts of stuff. That would not be reflected in WaveLab's metering. So playback processing is a nice spot, and I only mention it just because it's by design not included in rendering. So just wanted to mention it while we're here. I'm going to clear the master section now of these plugins because the rest of this video is going to be within the montage, and we'll use the effects within the montage. So the master section is, as you can see, free of any plugins, and it's set to 0. Faders are locked. It's just basically set to default Unity. So let's close these out. We're going to be done with the audio editor, and we're going to talk about various ways to render from the montage. So, as you know, if you use WaveLab, you can put plugins in a number of places, and this is where I'm going to switch to my preferred layout, which looks more like this. You can, of course, put plugins right on each clip. So this is a mock-up album kind of. Let's go to this little EP project. So for those that don't know, I can put plugins directly on each song, which is called a clip. I can put plugins on the track, which is not the CD or album track. It is the audio track. As you can see, I really have just 2 tracks in this session. I have track 1 with 2 lanes that has all my clips, and I have a reference track. So track effects would affect all of the songs if I inserted it equally, and it would be after the clip effects, and it would be before the montage output effects, which I do use. I tend to do like a lot of the main tone shaping and whatnot on clip effects, and then maybe I'll have a final limiter in the montage output effects that affects everything equally and after the clip effects. So that's just a quick overview of where we can insert plugins in the montage. Let's go with, I'm trying to think of where to start on this. Let's go with a feature. I'm trying to work my way up here. Let's go with a feature that not a lot of people know about in WaveLab as well, and that's the bounce feature. So I don't use it a whole lot, but I'll demonstrate what that looks like. I just split this song up into 3 clips. Sometimes you have to do strange things. I split the song up into 3 clips, and I'll put a plugin on the middle section. Let's say the middle section of the song needs a different set of processing. And this can be kind of hard to deal with. Let's say this is something you're really sure that you want to do. So you can select all three, and you can go to the process and bounce section. And what this is going to do is it's going to, I'm choosing to show this because in my opinion, it's rendering all three of those clips, and it's going to bake in any plugin processing and create a new clean clip. And as you can see, that middle section is quieter, created a new clip. And when it does that, it creates a data folder. And this file that I've highlighted is actually the new file that you see. So that's just a little thing that some people don't know about in WaveLab, is the bounce feature. It's similar to super clips. So let's say I did the same thing. I put a plugin on just, I got to reinsert it. Let's say I just put a plugin on the middle section of a song. Obviously you can put more than one. And I highlight all three, and I want to get rid of this edit and just lock it in and have it be clean. So it's easier to work with in other ways. You can right click on the top of the waveform. Let me redo that. Top of the waveform, create a super clip. Using these settings, it's going to, I had many clips selected by accident. Let's go back and just do the three we want to. It's going to create a new clip. So super clips and bouncing are very similar. So that's kind of a way to do some inside the montage bouncing before you're ready to do your final renders. I like to use the word render because some people use the word export. To me, exporting could mean you're exporting the source but without any processing, which is good for certain things but not necessarily mastering. So I like to use the term render because that's what WaveLab calls it as well. Rendering is when you're actually processing the audio through plugins and creating a new file that's outside of the montage or project. Let me just check this question. When creating a montage, should we leave 2 seconds of silence before the first song? You don't have to do that in WaveLab. In fact, here's a real live EP master. As you can see, my marker is right at 0. I do think it's important to have it right at 0, so then your timeline is, you don't have to offset your timeline. But we don't have to put, basically that 2 second pre-gap that's required for CD masters is built into the, it's built in, you don't have to think about it. So that way when you render your masters for, digital distribution, there's not 2 seconds of silence that is unwanted. So you basically don't have to think about it in WaveLab. If I made a DDP of this session, the 2 seconds would be added on to before this marker. So no need to worry about it. You just basically have to lay it out how you want it to sound in general. So I'm going to get to some CD and album sequencing things as I go through this montage section. But first I just wanted to cover that bounce and super clip feature because it's, again, somewhat hidden. I don't use it very often, but if I'm doing a weird edit or splice, having to splice things together, do this and that, it's a nice way to just get a solid file again. And be aware that it includes any clip effects, but it does not include any track or montage effects. It just basically creates a new clean clip with the plugins that were on the clip, and then it discards those plugins and gives you a fresh starting point. So now I'm going to talk about some kind of real world rendering cases about, if you're mastering an EP or an album or even a single, this is really going to apply. As I've talked about in other videos, I basically have a rendering practice that works for all scenarios, whether it's a single song, EP, or album, whether it has songs that overlap or don't overlap. It covers all of that because I just like to have one thing that works for everything. And you never know when suddenly an album is going to have overlapping songs. You could be doing an album, send it to the client. They say we'd love it, but we want to do a little crossfade on songs 2 and 3. Not a problem to do, but you wouldn't want to have to just change your whole entire rendering practice at that point, in my opinion. You want to just not even have to worry about it. So I'm going to go through how I get EPs and albums rendered out once I have all the processing dialed in. But before we do that, I do want to just go over the rendering options, and these are available on wavelabhelp.com. You can download all my settings, but also just the render presets. These are all presets that I've made for different rendering scenarios. The one I use most is at the top. That's my initial montage render once I'm happy with it. And then I have all these other variations, for doing singles that add a numeric prefix at the end of the file. Things that not only add side A or B at the end of the file, but they also change the rendering source. So for vinyl, I'll get into that as well. But you should really be aware of render presets if you're not using them. They save you, not only do they save you time, but they save you from making a dumb mistake that's easy to do, because as WaveLab has evolved, there's so many more render settings, than maybe there was 10 years ago. And the render presets were added about maybe 5 years ago just to help keep everything running smoothly, because, again, there's so many little settings that you can either forget or are just too tedious to keep changing every time. So render presets, great for that. Let me show you what I mean by that. So render presets basically just control everything from the options menu to the naming scheme. Naming scheme allows you to add additional characters to a generated file name. So let's say I'm going to render a wave of each song, which I wouldn't do from right here, and I'll tell you why. But my 24-bit wave of all the album tracks adds a numeric prefix naming scheme. So what that's going to do is put 01, and then it's going to use the region name. So basically, if I were going to render CD tracks, and a lot of people think CDs are dead. When I say CD tracks, it's more of a traditional term, album track. WaveLab still calls them CD tracks, but when I do want to render CD tracks, the region name is used. So by region name, it means the marker name. So if I rendered this album, I wouldn't just want a folder with these file names, because they're not going to be in order. They're going to be in alphabetical order, which is not correct for the album. So the numeric prefix naming scheme just adds the track number before each file name. So to give a quick example of that, let me just put it on the desktop. Let me just render this quick to show you what I mean. If I go into the desktop folder, now we have a nice folder. The songs are in the correct order because of that numeric prefix. If I wouldn't have done that, I would just have a folder of the files in alphabetical order, which is not great. You can edit the naming scheme. Aside from all the render presets, I have a ton of naming schemes which are called up by the render presets. But you can go in and edit that to be whatever you want. For what works for me is the counter is basically the track number. Then I have a empty space, and then I use the CD text track title for the file names, because without getting too far off track, I use the CD text title because that's usually a safe name. There's no special characters, because CD text, as you can see here, is restricted to ASCII, which is very basic characters. And I kind of set this up so you can look. Track 5 has this name in CD text, but actually the name has a special accent over the A. And that is why. So the accent is going to go to the metadata, but the CD text track title is going to be, it's going to overwrite that, and my file name is not going to have an accent, because file names with special characters can cause problems. So I want to get a little bit more back on track here, but be aware of the render presets, because that controls the options, that controls the naming scheme that is chosen, it controls the render source. Now that I'm in the montage, you can see there's a lot of possibilities for the render source. You can render the whole montage, which is what I do first for EPs and albums, and even singles, even though the whole montage is just one track. Because for singles, sometimes I'll have the main version, instrumental, clean version, things like that, all lined up back to back. So I always do whole montage no matter what I'm doing. but you can render a selected audio range. I use this for, let's say I'm dialing in a song transition and the client wants to hear, I don't want to send them a whole album master yet. I just want to say, do you like this song transition? I can highlight this. I have a preset called 320 MP3 selection. So basically it's going to make an MP3 of that selection, which in my opinion is good enough for asking them if they like how these songs overlap before I send a new album master. So selected audio range comes in handy. And of course, there's a million uses for WaveLab, so you may not even do anything that I do in WaveLab, but just be aware that you can render a selected audio range, active track, pretty self-explanatory. Union of selected clips, not something I use often, but if you have a bunch of selected clips that are touching, it'll render that. Selected CD track group. That is something I use for making actually vinyl and cassette masters, because what I'll do is in the CD tab, I will, let's say this is going to be a vinyl release. I'll say tracks 1, 2, and 3 are side A, 4, 5, and 6 are side B. I use the CD track groups to denote that. And then when I render vinyl and cassette sides, I use CD track group. As you can see, if I choose render preset vinyl side A, you'll see that it changes to CD track group A for me, and then I manually change it. And if I use, after that's rendered, I can do side B, and it changes to B. So I'll get there in more detail, but that's what I use CD track groups for. Specific marked region. Let's say for some reason you only want to render one song from this montage. I don't know why. It happens once in a while, but then you can choose specific marked region and choose that specific region. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Multiple outputs, all selected tracks, all track groups. I really don't use the multiple outputs ever, but just be aware that they're there. All selected clips is something that people use, I think, by mistake sometimes, and I'll show you why in my other montage. But it's important to remember that your clips are not your album tracks. As you can see here, this particular track, let's go to this one. This particular track called Amanda's Mantra, the clip is a certain length, but the actual album track contains almost an extra second of silence to create the right flow between the songs. So when we're done mastering and ready to send it off, we don't want to render clips because that's going to omit any space between the songs, which I think is bad. So that's a dangerous thing. I see people rendering selected clips quite often on the forums, and it's, again, it may seem like you're rendering the master, but if you do selected clips and you have gaps like this to set the song spacing, then your rendered files aren't going to contain that space, which means if they submit this for streaming, the space between songs is going to be less than what you anticipated in the montage that you set up. So that's basically the render source. The options in the result change based on what you're doing. As you can see, some get grayed out based on the source option. So when I'm rendering CD tracks, it's always a named file. And like I mentioned, the region name is always used. You have to determine the format, which is, again, say, part of the preset. But in case I went too quickly, I have a bunch of format presets. But honestly, the render preset does everything for me. I never have to go in these menus, only when I'm setting up an initial render preset or explaining things. So, but again, if you want to edit the format, there's all these different audio formats, different extensions, which I've already goofed up. Let's go back. I've actually thought about changing this to be stereo instead of match input stream. I'm always working in stereo anyway, so it's the same difference, but just to be safe and clear, I'm going to change this to stereo, just the channels. Sample rate, I also always match this input stream because I do all my sample rate conversion outside of WaveLab. I use the custom duplicate montage feature, which I'll show you. Bit depth, because with the preset I've chosen, I chose 24-bit, but we got all these options, and again, you can save it as just an audio format preset, which gets saved in the render presets. And then the options also change depending on what you've chosen as a source. For example, when I choose initial montage render, I'm rendering the whole montage, so you can see the options menu gets a little smaller, but we'll just go through it in this state. It's, as I mentioned, I don't use any master section effects, so I choose to bypass the master section just out of sort of a safety net, because even though there's no processing in there, I figure why not just bypass it just to be safe, just in case there ever was or something happened. For me, in theory, it's the same difference, but it's a little safety precaution. Save master preset. Siri thinks I'm talking to her. I'm not talking to you, Siri. So again, this doesn't matter to my workflow because I'm not using the master section, but there is a way to save the master section in the montage file. But for how I work, this setting is irrelevant. Fade in and out at boundaries, definitely not something I use in my normal montage work, because as you can see, I'm doing my own fades here to taper off things, so also not a feature I use. Reverb tail, not something I use. Copy markers is something I use for certain rendering practices, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But that basically means all the markers you see in this view, well, I'll just do it quick. There's no plugin, so it'll go fast. Again, I'm just going to put it on the desktop to keep it fast. But look at the resulting file. It made a new montage for me, and all the markers carried over. So that's what copy markers means. And additionally, it did that because I chose to create an audio montage from the result. That's why a new montage opened when it was done rendering. Create CD image in QSheet. Not really something I find myself needing anymore. But it's there if you want to create a QSheet. I used to need the QSheet for WaveLab to recreate some things about the montage, but that's no longer relevant with WaveLab 11. Open resulting file. I talked about that. I don't have it chosen because it's actually making a whole montage. I do choose open resulting file when I'm rendering vinyl sides because I want to, of course, check those. But yeah, so I'll do that. Open files in a new file group. I don't use file groups, so it's irrelevant to me. And just again, out of precaution, bypass master section on resulting rendered audio file. Same, really no effect because I don't have anything in there, but it just for triple safety net just bypasses it there. So, but as you can see, these are the options you get when you render the whole montage. When I go to render CD tracks, for example, there's another section here for including pause before and after track. Now, these are also settings I don't have to worry about because I bake all the... Sorry, I'm still not... Siri is really demanding a lot of attention today. I don't use any of these settings because all my spacing between songs is baked into the tracks and files, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that next. But I'll show you why you may want to use these if you're working in an old-fashioned way or need to get out of a tough situation. But I don't use these because all my stuff is baked in, like I mentioned. So I'm going to actually do something that I think is not ideal, but I see people doing, and that's going to kind of bring me around to why I do things the way I do them. So this is just a test montage I have for plugin testing, but let me delete the markers. And let's say I'm just spacing out this album in a way that sounds good. Pretend these are songs, even though it's just pink noise. Say, okay, this is great. I love how this sounds. Everything's great. Now, if I use the CD wizard to add markers, which is a common practice, this is the settings I normally use. I usually tell it to use splice markers, but I see a lot of people don't not using splice markers. So let me show you what that means. If I press apply on the CD wizard with these settings, with splice markers turned off, you get these end and start markers. I see this a lot where somebody has their markers arranged this way, where it's an end and a start, and you got the space in between. Now, when you play it to audition the pause, you might say, okay, that's a great amount of silence between those two songs. I love it. Obviously. But then when you go to render your tracks, if you don't have one of these options chosen, watch what happens. I'm going to again render to the desktop. I'll call it no gap. So let's say I was happy with this. I'm going to render these tracks to upload for streaming. And I have these markers, which I think are not ideal, but I see them used too so often that I'm going to talk about it. Let's say I render 20, it doesn't even matter, but 24-bit wave files of this track, each track, without one of these settings chosen. Watch what happens when I load them back in to compare with what I had. Oh yeah, I put these on the desktop. So let's say I load these in and line them up back to back. You're going to notice that instead of track 2 starting where it was in the montage, it starts over here now. So all this space got omitted when I rendered. So again, you got kind of like when you are, if you would have chosen render selected clips, you're perhaps accidentally omitting the space between the markers. So if you are using the old style of using an end marker followed by a start marker, here's what you want to do instead. You want to choose one of the options because you want to include, they call it the pause, but you want to include this empty space between the two markers somewhere. And I think most people would include it after the track. You can do it before, but when you choose after the track, I'll show you what happens. I'll just call it after track. Let's render that, bring it in on a reference track to compare. Now when I do that, you'll see that we have nice files, and the rendered files contain the space between the songs, and it's at the end of the track. Now, if I would have chosen before track, it would have put the silence at the start of the track, which I think is bad, because then you got 2 seconds of silence before the song starts. Typically, any spacing between the songs, any silence, lives at the end of the file, is kind of the unofficial rule. I agree, CDs are in demand. I don't know who's buying them. Clients are certainly pressing them. My opinion is you still want to, unless it's a very specialized album, you kind of want to lay it out and sequence it as if it were going to be on CD, because A, you never know if it's going to be on CD. And just the way that iTunes and Spotify are modeled, they're still modeled after the album format. They don't have this negative time. If I were to make a DDP or CD of this, those of you that are old enough to remember, CD players used to have a negative count. So it would be showing you the time. Well, in fact, I think it'll show us right here. CD players used to do this, and then it would, well, let's see if I can. Oh, negative times. Let's see what happens here. CD track. Well, long story short, CD players used to have a negative time, so it'd be like -2, 3, 2, 1 second, and then it would go to the next thing. Streaming services don't really have that, but my whole point is you kind of want to make sure you're rendering the silence that is between the clips. Now, what I do is I'm going to delete these markers because I don't use the end and start markers. I use CD track splice markers. If you check out my CD Wizard preset, you'll see that I chose the option to use splice markers. And that just makes life so much easier, because now it makes a marker. Now it makes a marker at the start of each clip, and any space, no matter what you render, basically this silence between the songs is going to get included. So with that, I want to kind of go over to some real world rendering, because, if this was the real album, I wouldn't have the markers right at the start of the clip. I would use this feature that has a shortcut called Move Multiple Markers, and move them back by 200 milliseconds so that there's a little buffer between the start of the track and the first downbeat. But my whole point was, you really want to be aware of what you're rendering. Selected clips is usually not good if you're doing an album. And if you're using those end and start markers, that's a recipe for something to go wrong. The DDP will be fine. The playback before you render will be fine, but your resulting files may be missing that silence. So let's go over to a real album here that or EP, I guess you could call it, that I've laid out. And I'll just give you a quick zoom in on my markers and how they relate to the clips. I'm just going to cycle through here. As you can see, my files have 200 milliseconds of silence baked in before the downbeat right here. So it's actually okay that my markers are generated at the start of each clip, because there's a built-in buffer, as you can see. Now this is interesting what I did on purpose. I cross-faded these two songs. So if you could hear the audio, you'd hear the song fading out, and this new one kicks in with a little drum beat. So that's pretty common with albums, so I thought I would show you how to deal with that. And then the last one. Now the first marker always has to be a start marker, which looks like that, and the last one always has to be an end marker. You can click on a marker and change the type. This would be not valid for CD. This would just be a headache. So I basically always have the first marker be a start marker. The rest are splice markers. And the last marker is an end marker. Pretty simple. I'm just going to see if there's any questions. All right, no new questions. So I think sometimes people think I'm a little ridiculous for rendering the whole montage first, but what that does, like I said earlier, is that gets you out of potential problems later. It also bakes in the processing at the highest bit depth and native sample rate, and then you can work your way down. So for example, if I let's say I'm happy with how this sounds and I wanted to render files. This is a 96K session. Let's say I rendered 24-bit 96K wave files. Well, that's great, but we need more than that usually. We often still need 16-bit 44.1 wave files for people that use CD Baby. We need a 44.1K montage for potentially making a DDP file or cassette master. Even though vinyl can be done from high sample rate, cassette is still done from 44.1 usually, because the places that can still make cassettes are old-fashioned. But either way, it's a little bit short-sighted to just render, let's say, 24-bit 96K waves of each song from this particular montage. It's a little bit short-sighted. You can do it, but you kind of paint yourself into some corners and things like that. So I always render the full montage. The other reason is plugins tend to behave a little better when they have some notice about what they need to do. A quick example, many years ago, before I had this technique, I was doing an album with a very similar crossfade. And in the DDP, the transition was seamless. It sounded perfect. But when I rendered the waves of each track, there was a little tick at the transition point. It was driving me nuts. And I said, why is this happening? The DDP is perfect. The rendered waves are not perfect. And the problem was that I was trying to render a track by track with too much plug-in processing happening. And when a DDP gets rendered, it's actually, and for those that don't know, DDP is what you use to make CDs, replicate CDs. It's basically just a special format for making CDs, but there's also DDP players, so you can double check the DDP before CDs are made. And honestly, DDP makes a great approval tool, even if CDs are not being made. If you can get your clients to listen to the DDP, then there's no issues that iTunes or Windows Media Player are adding. They can hear the transitions. It's great. But anyways, a DDP is technically one long render in one pass, and then the DDP format inserts the markers. So the reason I wasn't having this problem when I made the DDP is because WaveLab was doing one continuous render, so all the plugins had kind of notice, some forewarning of what needs to happen when that song starts. When you render track by track, it's a lot of stopping and starting. So this particular track is going to have a cold start, what I like to call a cold start. And what that means is that it's not really sample accurate at the beginning because it doesn't know what just happened before it. Sometimes certain third-party plugins are just not very well coded, and sometimes they struggle in the first few milliseconds. There's one plugin, I don't want to name the company. It's a good company, and I still use their plugins, but their renders from WaveLab had like a 45 millisecond fade-in, no matter what, which is not... That can go undetected on a normal CD track that has maybe 200 milliseconds before the first note or downbeat, but when you have gapless audio or a quick start, a 45 millisecond fade in can be very bad. So long story short, if you render the whole montage first, it mitigates a lot of plugin problems and just general rendering problems. I know that some people had to move from Sequoia and Soundblade. They were doing this technique in those apps too, because it's not really a WaveLab problem or workaround. It's just in general. If you're doing an EP or album, it's not a bad idea to just render it all in one pass to lock in all those gapless overlap transitions, and again lock in all the processing at the native sample rate and highest bit depth, and then we can work our way down from there. Because if I didn't say it before, even if I render 24-bit 96K waves from this session, I don't want to make my 44.1 files from these, because then that's 2 bit depth reductions. We're going from floating point in the montage to 24-bit and then 24-bit to 16. You know, whether or not you can hear that is debatable. Nobody's going to get injured or die, but I think it's best practice to just lock everything at the highest resolution and then work your way down later. So I'm getting a little long-winded, but I've done plenty of videos about how I arranged the montage this way and why and all that other stuff, where to put effects. So I'm going to skip over that and just get into the actual rendering. So there are no plugins going, so it's going to render fast, but let's say I was happy with how everything sounds and how everything's laid out. I choose my preset called Initial Montage Render, which again does the whole montage. It does not change the file name. One cool thing I like about WaveLab is this recent paths list. I use this all the time because instead of having to like create a whole new path name, I can select a path name and then manually edit, a variable, change a few characters. Let's see, I don't have this actually laid out like I normally do. This is kind of a mess today, actually, but let's just say 96K renders is what I'm going to do. Make a folder. That's my project. You do have to give the file a name when you do this initial render. Again, my folder structure is not as good as it should be with a real session, but let's just say I'll try to mimic it. WaveLab is the band name, Livestreams is the album name, and this is version 1. So with this preset, it's going to do all these things. It's going to bypass the master section, copy the markers, create a montage from the result, do the whole montage. It's going to save it in floating point, because even if you load in 24-bit files, the audio does not stay 24-bit once you start processing it. I'll have to load in actual 24-bit files to show you what I mean, because the files in my session, our floating point already, but here's the bit depth meter. This is a 24-bit file that it's playing back. As soon as I even change the gain, look at now it's floating point. If I were to put a plug-in on the clip, let me reset this line. So let's say the source file, this is the file that your client sent you, a 24-bit mix file to master. Let's say you load in an EQ, start EQing it, now suddenly you're at floating point. So interesting. So my whole point is, even though I've started with 24-bit audio, let's say, the fact that I'm doing all this processing means I want to render a 64-bit float wave to preserve all the bit depth and resolution that I'm doing in my processing. And eventually I'm going to be dithering to 24-bit and 16, but that's why it's set to 64-bit, because regardless of even if you get a 16-bit file to master for whatever reason, the audio does not stay 16-bit. When you start working on it, the bit depth increases, and you may want to preserve that. So I just want to make sure we're still live here. I lost a screen. And we'll get into some rendering practices here. So I gotta get Google Chrome open. Sorry about this delay. Sometimes my iPad, which is my third screen, disappears. Sorry about all the technical issues today. So let's say I'm ready to render this. That's what I would do. That's what I would name it. I'm going to create a special 96K renders folder in the project because of reasons you'll see shortly. But it's going to go pretty quickly because there's no plugins to process. So now I've created, or WaveLab has created, a new montage with all the plugins baked in, all the song spacing baked in, all the markers, everything is, I basically have a mirror image of this montage, but with all the plugin processing baked in. Now this is where I save. Now we need to save this montage. So I have a little trick where I copy the name of the source montage and paste it over to the new one and change it to 2496. But even better, I have a Stream Deck thing that you can watch happen while I talk. That copies the name and renames the source montage for me, so I don't have to think about it and no mistakes are made. You can do this with Keyboard Maestro as well. So it named the montage, saved it, and it prompted me, this is all Stream Deck programming stuff, to insert a dither plug, well, insert any plugin, but I have a 24-bit dither because, as we'll see, if I were to bypass that dither, you can see that the audio is floating point. And if I enable the dither, then now the audio is 24-bit. So now I'm ready to render. I could, in theory, render 24-bit 96K waves of this project just by doing this. I like to copy the name of the initial file I did, paste it in there, and just add 2496 wave. And I could render 24-bit waves of each track, and I'm going to show you what that transition looks like once it renders. This is taking a little longer because this dither plugin is running. But if I make a new montage, I do this a lot, obviously. Because of course you always want to check your work. So if I make a new montage and just load these in to test and listen, that part where it overlapped, this is sample perfect. There's going to be no tick or pop or disruption during that song transition. I see people struggle with gapless transitions a lot in mastering, and you don't have to make a compromise. Some people will give up and they'll just do a quick fade out and back in to get rid of a pop or tick. Well, in my opinion, that's even more obvious. It's what the audio drops out for a split second. So with the way that I'm working, There's absolutely no disruption here. I do this test with test tones as well, where it's really easy to tell. So again, that's part of why I do the whole render it first, because you never know when a record's going to be gapless, and you never know when a plugin is, even if the record's not gapless, you never know when a plugin is going to have a rendering issue where it's fine on playback, but the first few milliseconds is incorrect. And just rendering it in one pass where it has a little bit of forewarning just clears up so many problems. Yes, it is slightly annoying if you just have to change one song. I still render the whole thing because, in my opinion, that's easier than just rendering one song and then trying to work it into something else. And then also you're going to want the final full montage if you have to break off for a vinyl master or potential another revision. You know, if you start taking these shortcuts, you know, you start to create future problems for yourself. If, you know, let's say you could say, oh, but you only had to change the EQ on song 3. Why don't you just render a new version of song 3? Well, you can do that, but then you start to create future problems if you get to version 3 of the album, and you lose track of what's changed. You know, this song changed here, that song changed there. I just keep it all the same. So if there was a revision, I just do save as version 2, render the whole thing again. Takes a couple extra minutes, but there's always an email to send or check, and then you're not creating any confusion for yourself later. And then when the master is approved, you just got to do save as, branch off for your vinyl or your cassette or your instrumentals or whatever you're doing. So that is, but before I forget, I rendered 2496K waves, but that's usually something I deliver when the project is approved. If you wanted to deliver, say, you know, 16-bit 44.1 files or MP3s at 44.1 sample rate, there's a cool feature called custom montage duplicate. So just to prove that you can do this, a lot of people like to use RX for sample rate conversion. I'm going to downsample that full file that I did, the floating point 96K with all the processing baked in. I'm going to convert it. You can do this with the WaveLab batch processor too. Some people get kind of concerned about leaving WaveLab. You can do this with the WaveLab batch processor as well. But to me, there's really no difference if you're getting out of the montage. It doesn't matter what you use. So while that's processing, I'm going to show you the slow way of file, new, custom from current file, customize duplicate. When I choose this, a menu pops up and says, you know, create a new montage duplicate, but where is the file? That's why I have a separate 44.1 renders folder, because the files have to have the same name, and you can't have the same file name in the same folder. Computer does not like that. So I have a special folder for those, and it creates the montage at that lower sample rate. All the markers are in place. The faster way is to just copy the name for future. Then I have a shortcut, which is command /, maybe it's actually /. It's right above the return key. Point it to that folder, and in less than a second, you got a montage at 44.1 sample rate. All the processing's baked in, all your markers are there, all your CD text is there. I did a whole episode on metadata and CD text, but everything stays. So that when you do, let's say you want to render 24-bit 44.1K ref files for approval, this is what I love about this rendering path location. You can just alter the 2 characters, and now we're rendering 24-bit 44.1, and because I have my metadata preset already loaded up here, as you can see, it's doing a lot of things. There's a whole metadata episode, but if I go to these files that I've rendered, you're going to see that they all have metadata added automatically. I didn't even have to think about it. So it all carries over very easily. And the other thing that I've seen people struggle with is, again, if you're rendering selected clips, you're not rendering CD tracks. And the metadata is basically inherited from CD text. So you really, if you're doing EPs and albums like I'm usually doing, you want to make sure you're rendering CD tracks, make sure you have the CD text populated because that turns into metadata. And again, as sort of a example here, one of the songs had a special character. You can see the special character was in the marker name. The special character was not in the CD text name because I have restrict to ASCII turned on. That's usually what you want, because if you try to do special characters in CD text, it can have display problems. So you see that for the CD text version, I took that out. And here's what we get on the resulting render. The file is called that. There's no accent. But if you open the file and look at the metadata, it has it. So that's just a nice little workaround that I have for special characters and song names. I keep it in the marker name, keep it out of the CD text. The generated file name comes from the CD text, which is usually a safer set of characters. And the metadata, of course, comes from the marker, which can contain special characters. So, as I mentioned, from here I can render 24-bit waves. It's all part of these render presets. If I want to do 16-bit, I personally prefer to make a new save as montage, change it to 1644, load a 16-bit dither. Because, as I mentioned earlier, WaveLab does not automatically dither. Just because I chose 16-bit wave tracks now from this menu, and I have it set to 16-bit here, WaveLab doesn't dither for me. If I wouldn't have this dither plugin loaded, it's just going to truncate the bit depth. And to show you that in reverse, it's hard to show you what I just said, but to show you in reverse, I'm going to have a 16-bit dither loaded. So as you can see on the bit depth meter, it's 16. The audio stream is 16-bit. I'm going to render a 24-bit file and watch what happens after it's rendered. I'll put a little X in there. So I'm rendering 24. I'm telling it to make a 24-bit file, but the dither is set to 16. Watch what happens when I open this file. Let's see what happens here. Yeah, exactly. So it's technically a 24-bit file, as you can see from the bottom right corner. I'm in the audio editor now. So if you just look at this file in the Mac Finder, you're going to say, oh, it's a 24-bit file. Great. But if you play the audio, it's reduced to 16-bit, the actual audio. So basically, it's a 24-bit container with 16-bit audio. So my whole point, though, was just because you're telling WaveLab to render 16-bit audio in the format section, you still have to take care of the dithering by yourself, manually. Because if I didn't have a dither plugin, watch what happens. We got floating point audio. And if I just render to 16-bit, it's just going to truncate all that bit depth off. And, maybe for most types of music, you can't hear the truncation errors. But if you're a fan of best practices, you want to do, that dithering. So you want to be in control. So just be aware that nothing is automatic when it comes to dithering. You got to set the format, bit depth, and you have to do the dithering yourself. So that's just something I wanted to point out for people to be aware of when they're rendering, is set the format and then also set the correct dithering setting to what you want, because it's really two steps and not just one. So, if I wanted to make MP3s, I have a preset for that, 320 kilobyte per second MP3s. And again, I can just modify this folder name. Even though the folder doesn't exist, it will as soon as I press render. I've been using the shortcut, which is Command Return on Mac, but you can just press the render start button. And I didn't add artwork. I could have added artwork to these MP3s, but I've done that in plenty of other videos. But as you can see, the metadata's there. You got a nice folder. So just be aware of these. And if I'm doing singles, I just did a single this morning. Let's see. I'll open one of the variations. But if I'm just doing a single, I have these other numeric naming scheme, which kind of puts a suffix on the file name. So if I go to this project that I did earlier today, this is kind of what the folder looks like. I go through the whole process. In fact, my last video is about doing singles, but that's what the folder ends up looking like. I deliver everything from a 24-bit 96K wave down to 1644 and MP3, all easily done and named with the naming scheme. I can show you vinyl. I did a whole episode on vinyl as well, but the important thing with rendering for vinyl is, you want to choose vinyl side A in my presets, which is CD track group. I use the track groups to determine the sides. And I guess just if you're really interested in this, watch the special video about rendering vinyl and cassette sides. But the whole point is that you can render a wave of each side, and then the PDF will match the wave file. Let's see if I've made any vinyl masters lately. I just recently cleaned off my hard drive, so... Well, there's probably one outgoing. So this is eventually what your folder would look like. You would have a wave of each side, which is, the full length of each of that vinyl side. Then you have a matching PDF with where each song starts for the cutting engineer. So watch the vinyl rendering video if you really want to get into that. But I'm just going to check my notes. I'll check the questions, make sure we're not skipping over anything. I've talked about DDP. DDP is the one thing that is not in the render ribbon tab exactly. I mean, it kind of is if you go to whole montage and do it this way. I actually never do it that way. I have a preset which is shift and you press the letter D twice, but also it's, I believe, under tools. I honestly don't even know where it is because I use the shortcut. Maybe it's under export. Well, basically, when you render a DDP, it looks like this because it's a slightly different process that takes over your whole screen. So you can't really do anything else when a DDP is being rendered. This box pops up, and you're kind of stuck just watching it go until it's done rendering the DDP. But I thought I would include rendering the DDP in this video. But yeah, I mean, you could go to whole montage, choose CD DDP. It brings, I guess it does bring the box up that way. But my whole point is I have a shortcut program to just bring up the DDP dialog box. But I've had some people looking for DDP rendering in the render tab, and it's sort of more hidden than the rest of the formats. So let me see if we got any other things to touch on. I touched on the naming scheme, so you can, I've seen some people add their own initials at the end, mastered by so-and-so. I have a prefix for, if I'm doing a double CD, it adds the disc number and then the track number, which is kind of handy. All sorts of variations you can add for the naming scheme. As far as my presets go, the only difference between cassette and vinyl is, well, as I mentioned at the start of the video, at least in the US, the main place that makes cassettes is National Audio Company. They still request 16-bit 44.1K audio because they have such old machines. So if you send them high sample rate audio, they're going to downsample it. And we don't know what they use. It could be terrible. So I deliver all my cassette masters at 16-bit 44.1. So the main difference between my cassette and vinyl render presets is just the bit depth. The sample rate is dictated by the montage itself, but the bit depth is really what changes there between the two. Yeah, I got a bunch of things for singles. So I'm just going to check my notes again, but we might be getting close to the end here. I see some questions about favorite plugins. I'm going to get into that next month when we do the interview with Katie Tavini. We're going to do more of a general mastering Q&A. It can be things that are outside of the WaveLab topic, just to kind of have a fun end of the year thing. But it looks like I've touched on everything. You know, I showed how to do a gapless thing and why I do the whole montage first for EPs and albums. It may seem redundant or overkill, but it's going to save you. You know, I've seen many panicked forum posts about people trying to make a gapless master and they can't do it. But if you just follow those steps of rendering it all in one thing first, using the splice markers, making sure that when you are rendering track by track, I can rent the dither plugin I use, which is Good dither. I can render track by track with that and not have any sample errors. But if you have higher intense CPU intense plugins with latency and perhaps not 100% great coding, you know, if you try to go those gapless transitions with heavy plugin load, you're kind of asking for a sample discrepancy that causes a click or a pop at the transition once you you know, reassemble those to test them out, how it's going to react on a streaming service or things like that. So I covered all that. If there's any questions about rendering, you know, feel free to join the WaveLab users group on Facebook. There's a wavelabhelp.com website. There is the actual WaveLab forum on the Steinberg website, which is a great place because the WaveLab developer, PG, he's always on there to answer questions as well. Yeah, hopefully that kind of clears up some things about rendering, whether you're trying to do CD tracks or just a selected audio range. You know, you can select a section and choose selected audio range. You know, if for some reason you just want to get that. Again, I've used that for if somebody says, it's great, but can you overlap these two songs before I send them a whole new master? Or if they want to fine tune and say, can you move it a little closer, a little further? Sometimes I'll use the selected audio range and then just choose this 320 MP3 selection preset, which is just going to, because the reason I do that is it's a very quick process because it's just got to bounce that or render that section. And it just creates a small MP3 that I can attach to an email and it won't be a problem just for them to just kind of proof it. And then, of course, once they're happy with that, I render the whole album and then they proof that. But sometimes that little preset saves a little time. Otherwise, I think I'm just rambling at this point. So thanks for watching. Again, next month, December 14th with Katie Tavini from the UK. She'll talk about mastering WaveLab, a little bit of how she uses WaveLab, and then we can get at some favorite plugin topics and things like that. So until then, hopefully this clears up some rendering confusion, opens some points of interest for next time you're rendering. If you're accidentally leaving out those spaces between the songs or accidentally not dithering because you think that choosing the format is going to automatically dither it for you, it does not. All sorts of those things. Hopefully, little by little, you can improve the quality of your audio. So I'm going to sign off here. Thanks again for watching. We will see you next month, and thanks for using WaveLab.